Sometimes the worst moment of your life is only a few minutes away from becoming the best one. Emily Carter repeated those words silently as she sat alone at a small cafe table near the front window. Outside, a light spring rain drifted across the streets of downtown Chicago, leaving tiny drops of water on the glass. Inside, warm lights reflected off polished wooden tables while quiet music played in the background. It should have been a pleasant evening. Instead, Emily could feel embarrassment slowly settling into her chest. She glanced at her phone again. 6:48. Her date had been scheduled for 6:30. At first, she told herself traffic was probably the reason. Then she blamed the weather. Then she convinced herself he might be struggling to find parking. But as the minutes passed, each explanation felt less believable. 20 minutes earlier, she had arrived feeling hopeful. It had taken courage to accept the invitation in the first place. As a 33-year-old single mother raising her 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, Emily rarely made time for herself. Between work, school schedules, grocery shopping, laundry, and helping with homework, her days were always full. Dating had become something she barely thought about anymore. Yet after months of encouragement from friends, she had finally agreed to meet someone. She had spent nearly an hour choosing what to wear. Nothing fancy, just a simple navy blue dress and a light cardigan. She wanted to look confident without looking like she was trying too hard. Now, sitting alone with an untouched cup of tea, she felt foolish for caring so much. Her phone remained silent. No message, no explanation, no apology. Emily forced a small smile when the waitress stopped by to ask if she needed anything else. "I am fine, thank you," she replied politely. The moment the waitress walked away, the smile disappeared. Around her, conversations continued. Couples laughed together. Friends shared stories about their week. Life moved forward as though nothing unusual was happening. Emily stared out the window and remembered the many times she had promised herself she would stop expecting good things to happen. Every time she allowed hope into her life, disappointment seemed to follow. Yet she could not completely blame the man who failed to appear. What truly hurt was the feeling of being forgotten. Across town, Sophie was spending the evening with Emily's sister. Her daughter had been excited about the date all week. "You deserve to have fun too, Mom," she had said with a bright smile. Emily's heart tightened at the memory. She wanted to be the kind of woman her daughter believed she was. Strong, optimistic, brave. Instead, she felt small. She reached for her purse, deciding it was finally time to leave. Then the cafe door opened. A tall man stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat before looking around the room. His expression was calm, confident, and thoughtful. For a brief moment, his eyes moved across the cafe until they landed on Emily sitting alone by the window. Neither of them knew it yet, but that single glance was about to change everything. Emily quickly looked away, assuming the stranger had merely been searching for an empty table. Yet when she gathered her purse and prepared to leave, she noticed him approaching. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed her face. The man stopped a respectful distance from her table and offered a polite smile. "Excuse me," he said. "I hope this does not sound strange, but are you waiting for someone?" Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks. Part of her wanted to deny it. Another part was simply too tired to pretend. "I was," she answered honestly. The man glanced toward the empty chair across from her and seemed to understand immediately. "I am sorry," he said. "That must be disappointing." Emily laughed softly, though there was little humor in the sound. "I suppose it is not how I imagined my evening going." The stranger nodded. Life rarely follows the script we write for it. Something about his calm tone felt genuine. He was not trying to impress her. He was not offering pity. He simply sounded like someone who understood disappointment. "I am Alexander," he said. "Emily." For a second, neither spoke. Rain tapped gently against the cafe windows while customers continued chatting around them. Alexander glanced toward the counter. "Would it be completely inappropriate if I bought you a fresh cup of tea before you leave?" Emily almost declined out of habit. She had spent years handling problems alone. Accepting kindness from strangers was not something she did easily. Yet there was something reassuring about his presence. "I think I can accept a cup of tea," she replied. Minutes later, they sat across from each other. Emily was surprised by how comfortable the conversation felt. Alexander asked simple questions. Where did she grow up? What kind of work did she do? What did she enjoy when she actually had free time? The questions were ordinary, but the way he listened made them feel important. When Emily mentioned her daughter Sophie, Alexander's expression brightened. How old is she? 8, Emily answered. And she is probably the smartest person in our family. Alexander laughed. That sounds like something a proud mother would say. It is completely true, Emily replied with a smile. For the first time that evening, the disappointment that had followed her into the cafe began to fade. Meanwhile, Alexander found himself fascinated by the woman sitting across from him. She spoke about her daughter with warmth and pride. She described challenges without bitterness. Even when discussing difficult moments, she focused on gratitude instead of complaints. It was a quality he rarely encountered. As the conversation continued, Emily noticed several people greeting Alexander as they passed. Employees seemed to recognize him. One manager even stopped briefly to shake his hand. She found it slightly unusual, but thought little of it. What mattered was that she no longer felt alone. Nearly an hour passed before Emily checked the time. Her eyes widened. I cannot believe it is already this late. Alexander smiled. That usually means the conversation was worth having. Emily looked out the rain-covered window and realized something unexpected. The evening she had nearly written off as a complete disaster no longer felt like a disaster at all. In fact, it was beginning to feel like the start of something she never saw coming. When Emily finally left the cafe that evening, the rain had softened to a light mist drifting through the city streets. She paused beneath the awning near the entrance and looked back through the window. Alexander was still inside, speaking briefly with one of the managers before preparing to leave himself. For reasons she could not explain, she found herself smiling. The evening had begun with disappointment, yet she was walking away feeling lighter than she had in weeks. During the drive home, Emily replayed parts of their conversation in her mind. Nothing dramatic had happened. There had been no grand gestures, no impossible coincidences, and no promises about the future. Instead, there had simply been kindness. After years of handling most challenges alone, she realized how rare genuine kindness had become. When she arrived at her sister's house to pick up Sophie, her daughter immediately noticed the change in her expression. You look happy, Sophie announced the moment Emily stepped through the door. Emily laughed. Do I? Sophie nodded confidently. Definitely. Emily crouched beside her daughter and smiled. Maybe I just had a better evening than I expected. On the drive home, Sophie asked dozens of questions. Had the date gone well? Was the man nice? Would there be another date? Emily carefully chose her words. The person I was supposed to meet never showed up. Sophie's face immediately fell. That is terrible. It is okay, Emily replied. Something unexpected happened instead. She briefly described meeting Alexander at the cafe. Sophie listened with complete fascination. So a stranger sat down and talked to you? Emily nodded. Yes. And he was nice? Very nice. Sophie leaned back in her seat, thinking carefully. Sometimes the wrong thing happens so the right thing can happen later. Emily glanced at her daughter and smiled. It was exactly the sort of wisdom children somehow delivered without realizing it. Meanwhile, across town, Alexander found himself equally distracted by the evening. Back in his penthouse apartment overlooking the Chicago skyline, he stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows and thought about Emily. He met people every day through business meetings, charity events, and professional obligations. Most conversations blurred together, yet this one felt different. There had been something refreshingly genuine about her. She never tried to impress anyone. She never exaggerated her accomplishments. Everything about her felt real. The following morning, Emily expected life to return to normal. School lunches needed packing. Work responsibilities waited. Household chores remained unfinished. Yet around mid-morning, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar message. Her heart skipped slightly when she opened it. Good morning. I hope you and Sophie made it home safely. This is Alexander. I realized I never asked for your number, so I asked the cafe manager to pass mine along in case you wanted it. Emily stared at the screen. A smile slowly spread across her face. The message was polite, respectful, and completely free of pressure. She appreciated that. After a moment, she typed a response. Good morning. We made it home safely. Thank you for the tea and the conversation. Almost immediately, his reply appeared. Thank you for making a rainy evening much more interesting. Emily looked down at her phone and laughed softly. For the first time in a very long time, she found herself genuinely looking forward to whatever came next. Over the next 2 weeks, The messages between Emily and Alexander became a regular part of their daily lives. What surprised Emily most was how natural everything felt. There was no pressure, no awkward attempts to impress one another. Instead, each conversation seemed to pick up exactly where the previous one ended. Some mornings began with a simple good morning message. Other days started with a funny observation about the weather, work, or something Sophie had said before school. Emily often found herself smiling at her phone during lunch breaks. It had been a long time since she looked forward to hearing from someone. One evening, while helping Sophie finish a school project about local history, Emily's phone buzzed. Alexander had sent a picture of the Chicago skyline at sunset. The buildings glowed orange and gold beneath the fading light. "I thought you might appreciate this view," the message said. Emily stared at the photograph for a moment before replying. "That is beautiful." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Not as beautiful as the reaction I imagined Sophie would have if someone told her school was canceled tomorrow." Emily laughed out loud. Sophie immediately looked up from her project. "What is funny?" Emily hesitated before answering. "A friend made a joke." Sophie narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "The nice friend from the cafe?" Emily could not help smiling. "Yes." Sophie nodded approvingly and returned to her project. As the days passed, Emily learned more about Alexander. He traveled frequently for work. He enjoyed photography. He volunteered with several educational programs for children. Yet despite his obvious success, he rarely spoke about himself. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in hearing about her life. He remembered details she mentioned weeks earlier. He asked about Sophie's science assignments. He checked in after difficult workdays. Small gestures like that mattered more than grand displays ever could. One Saturday afternoon, Alexander invited Emily and Sophie to a public science fair sponsored by a local community organization. Emily almost declined. Years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious whenever something seemed too good to be true. But Sophie was instantly excited. "Please, Mom," she begged. "It sounds amazing." The following weekend, they arrived at the event together. The moment Sophie entered the exhibition hall, her eyes widened with excitement. Interactive displays filled the room. Students demonstrated creative projects. Families wandered between exhibits. Alexander greeted them near the entrance with a warm smile. Watching him interact with Sophie surprised Emily. He listened attentively to every question. He encouraged her curiosity. Most importantly, he treated her with genuine respect rather than speaking down to her. As the afternoon continued, Emily noticed something else. Several organizers approached Alexander to thank him for supporting the event. A few even referred to him as one of their largest donors. Emily suddenly remembered the cafe manager greeting him on the night they met. For the first time, she began realizing there was much more to Alexander's life than he had shared. Yet what impressed her most was not his success. It was the fact that he never seemed interested in talking about it. As they walked toward the parking lot later that afternoon, Sophie looked up at her mother and smiled. "I really like him." Emily felt her heart skip slightly. Looking ahead at Alexander laughing about something Sophie had just said, she realized she liked him too. Perhaps much more than she was ready to admit. That evening, after dropping Sophie off at a friend's birthday party, Emily found herself thinking about Alexander far more than she intended. She sat alone in her apartment with a cup of tea and replayed moments from the science fair. The way he listened when Sophie explained her ideas. The patience he showed with every question. The genuine interest in people around him. None of it felt forced. More importantly, none of it felt designed to impress anyone. It was simply who he was. Her phone buzzed shortly after 8 o'clock. A message from Alexander appeared on the screen. "I think Sophie may have taught me more today than I taught her." Emily laughed before replying. She would be very pleased to hear that. A few moments later, another message arrived. "She reminds me of someone." Emily already knew the answer. Her mother? Exactly. Emily felt warmth spread across her face. Compliments usually made her uncomfortable, but somehow his words felt sincere rather than rehearsed. Over the following weeks, their friendship continued growing stronger. They met for coffee several times. Occasionally, they shared lunch when schedules allowed. Sophie became increasingly comfortable around Alexander, often asking whether he would be joining them during weekend activities. One Saturday morning, they visited a community book festival. Sophie disappeared into a world of stories and educational displays while Emily and Alexander walked nearby, discussing everything from childhood memories to future goals. At one point, Emily finally asked the question she had been quietly wondering about for weeks. Why do so many people seem to know you? Alexander smiled. That sounds dangerous. It is a fair question. He laughed softly before answering. I own a few companies. Some people recognize me because of work. Emily stopped walking. A few companies? Alexander nodded casually. Something like that. The simplicity of his response immediately made her suspicious. Later that evening, curiosity finally got the better of her. After Sophie went to bed, Emily searched his name online. What she discovered left her staring at the screen in disbelief. Alexander Hayes was not simply successful. He was one of the most respected business leaders in the country. Articles described his companies, charitable foundations, and investments. Financial magazines estimated his wealth in the billions. Emily leaned back slowly. Suddenly, many things made sense. The people recognizing him, the event sponsorships, the community programs. Yet what surprised her most was how little any of that matched the man she knew. The Alexander in the articles sounded impressive. The Alexander she knew sounded kind. The following afternoon, she decided to address it directly. You forgot to mention something important, she texted. Several minutes later, he responded. That sounds serious. You are apparently very wealthy. A long pause followed. Then his answer appeared. I was hoping you liked me before learning that part. Emily laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. You could have warned me. Would it have changed anything? She thought about the question carefully. The honest answer was no. Before she knew anything about his finances, she already respected him. She already trusted him. What mattered most had nothing to do with money. Later that night, as they continued talking, Emily realized something important. The man who sat down beside her in a cafe weeks earlier had never acted like a billionaire. He had acted like a friend. And somehow that made him even more extraordinary. The discovery of Alexander's success changed surprisingly little between them. If anything, it strengthened Emily's appreciation for him. She had met wealthy people before through work and community events. Most of them seemed eager to discuss accomplishments, investments, or influence. Alexander was different. Even after she learned the truth, he continued showing up exactly the same way he always had. He still asked about Sophie's school projects. He still remembered small details from conversations. He still listened more than he spoke. One afternoon, several weeks later, Emily received a call from Sophie's teacher. At first, she worried something was wrong. Instead, she learned that Sophie had been selected for an advanced regional science program designed for gifted students. Emily felt both excited and concerned. The opportunity was incredible. Unfortunately, participation required travel, specialized materials, and additional expenses that would strain an already tight budget. That evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table reviewing numbers while Sophie completed homework nearby. She wanted desperately to support her daughter, but the reality was difficult. Rent, utilities, groceries, and school expenses already consumed most of her income. Sophie eventually noticed the worried expression on her mother's face. Everything okay? She asked softly. Emily immediately smiled. Everything is fine. Sophie tilted her head. That means it is probably not fine. Emily laughed despite herself. Her daughter knew her too well. Later that night, while exchanging messages with Alexander, she briefly mentioned the science program. She intended it as simple conversation, nothing more. Yet Alexander immediately recognized the significance. That sounds like an incredible opportunity. It is, Emily replied. I just need to figure out how to make everything work. Alexander did not push for details. Instead, he asked questions about the program itself. What would Sophie learn? What projects interested her most? What excited her about the experience? Emily appreciated that. He focused on the dream rather than the obstacle. Over the following days, Sophie spoke constantly about the program. She researched ideas. She filled notebooks with sketches and plans. Her enthusiasm filled the apartment with energy. Watching her daughter dream so confidently reminded Emily why she worked so hard. One Saturday morning, Alexander invited Emily and Sophie to visit a technology and innovation center sponsored by one of his foundations. Sophie could barely contain her excitement. The building featured interactive exhibits, educational workshops, and opportunities for young students to explore science and engineering concepts. Throughout the visit, Emily noticed how naturally Alexander encouraged young people. He treated every question seriously. He celebrated curiosity. Most importantly, He made children feel capable of achieving big things. Near the end of the afternoon, Sophie wandered toward an exhibit while Emily and Alexander remained behind. For a moment, they stood quietly watching her. "You are doing an amazing job with her," Alexander said. Emily looked away modestly. "Some days it does not feel that way. From where I am standing, it does." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. There was no exaggeration, no attempt to impress her, just honest admiration. As they continued walking, Emily realized how much Alexander had become part of their lives. Not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through consistency. He showed up. He listened. He cared. And somewhere along the way, the friendship that began in a cafe had become one of the most important relationships either of them had ever known. Neither was quite ready to say it aloud, but both could feel it growing stronger with every passing day. As summer approached, life settled into a comfortable rhythm for Emily, Sophie, and Alexander. What had started as an unexpected conversation in a cafe now felt like a natural part of everyday life. Alexander joined them for weekend activities when his schedule allowed. Sophie eagerly shared updates about school, science projects, and future dreams. Emily found herself looking forward to every message, every phone call, and every opportunity to spend time together. Yet despite all the happiness, one concern remained quietly in the background. The regional science program was approaching quickly, and the financial challenges had not disappeared. Emily continued searching for solutions. She picked up extra hours whenever possible. She adjusted her budget repeatedly. She even began selling a few unused items around the apartment. Every small effort helped, but the numbers still refused to cooperate. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Emily sat alone reviewing expenses for what felt like the 100th time. Her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The opportunity was so close. She could almost see her daughter's excitement becoming reality. Yet she still could not figure out how to make everything work. Her phone buzzed. "Alexander. Long day?" he asked. Emily considered pretending everything was fine. Instead, she answered honestly. "A little." Within minutes, they were talking. She explained the situation without asking for help or expecting solutions. She simply needed someone to listen. Alexander listened carefully, just as he always did. When she finished, there was a brief pause before he spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." If money were not part of the equation, would Sophie absolutely participate? Emily laughed softly, without hesitation. "Then that tells me how important this is." She smiled. "It is important." Alexander changed the subject soon afterward, and Emily assumed the conversation was over. The next few days passed normally. Then, one Friday afternoon, Sophie rushed through the apartment door holding an envelope from school. "Mom, look," she shouted excitedly. Emily opened the envelope and began reading. Her eyes widened almost immediately. According to the letter, Sophie had been awarded a special educational scholarship connected to the science program. The scholarship would cover nearly every remaining expense. For a moment, Emily simply stared at the page. "Mom," Sophie asked nervously, "is that good?" Emily pulled her daughter into a hug. "It is wonderful." Sophie jumped up and down with excitement, while Emily tried to process what had happened. The scholarship was legitimate. The organization behind it was well respected. Everything appeared completely official. Later that evening, Emily shared the news with Alexander. His reaction seemed genuinely enthusiastic. "That is incredible. I cannot believe it happened." "Sometimes good people catch a break," he replied. The answer sounded simple, yet something about his smile during their video call caught Emily's attention. It almost looked as though he knew more than he was saying. She considered asking, but ultimately decided not to. What mattered most was seeing Sophie happy. A week later, while attending a community event together, Emily accidentally overheard two organizers discussing the scholarship program. One sentence immediately caught her attention. They mentioned Alexander's foundation. Suddenly, the pieces fit together. The scholarship, the timing, his unusually calm reaction. Emily looked across the room and found Alexander talking with several students. In that moment, she realized the truth. The opportunity that changed Sophie's future had not arrived through luck alone. Someone who cared deeply had quietly opened a door without asking for recognition. And Emily felt more grateful than words could express. Emily spent the next several days debating whether she should mention what she had discovered. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that Alexander had somehow played a role in Sophie's scholarship. Yet she also understood why he would never openly admit it. Throughout the months they had known each other, he consistently avoided drawing attention to his generosity. He helped people because he genuinely wanted to help, not because he wanted recognition. Still, Emily felt she owed him her gratitude. One evening, they met at a quiet lakeside park overlooking Lake Michigan. The summer air was warm, and families filled the walking paths nearby. Sophie had joined a group activity hosted by a local youth organization, giving Emily and Alexander a rare opportunity to talk alone. For a while, they simply walked together in comfortable silence. Then Emily finally spoke. "I learned something interesting this week." Alexander glanced toward her with a curious smile. "That sounds dangerous. Your foundation sponsors Sophie's scholarship program." His expression remained calm, but Emily noticed a slight change in his eyes. It was all the confirmation she needed. "Alexander." He laughed softly. "I had a feeling this conversation might happen eventually." Emily stopped walking and looked at him. "Why?" The answer came without hesitation. "Because she earned the opportunity." Emily shook her head gently. "You helped make it possible." Alexander looked out across the water before responding. "I opened a door. Sophie walked through it herself." For a moment, Emily struggled to find words. She thought about every sacrifice, every worry, and every late night spent wondering how she would provide opportunities for her daughter. Then she thought about the man standing beside her, a man who quietly changed lives while asking for nothing in return. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander smiled. "You never need to thank me for believing in her." The sincerity of his answer touched her deeply. Later, as they continued walking, the conversation shifted toward more personal topics. They talked about family, childhood memories, and dreams they had never fully shared before. For the first time, Alexander spoke openly about loneliness. Despite his success, he admitted there were years when he felt disconnected from the people around him. Business achievements filled headlines, but they rarely filled empty spaces in life. Emily listened carefully. She understood that feeling better than most. Being a single mother often meant carrying responsibilities alone, even while surrounded by people. As the sun slowly began setting over the lake, something subtle changed between them. The friendship that had grown steadily for months felt deeper now. More honest, more vulnerable. Neither seemed interested in hiding behind polite conversations anymore. Near the end of the evening, they found a bench overlooking the water. The sky glowed orange and gold as sailboats drifted across the horizon. Emily looked toward Alexander and realized something important. The man who walked into that cafe months earlier had become one of the most trusted people in her life. Not because of his wealth, not because of his success, but because of his character. At that exact moment, Sophie came running toward them with excitement after finishing her activity. Without thinking, she sat between them and wrapped an arm around each of them. "You two look happy," she announced confidently. Emily and Alexander exchanged amused glances. Neither argued, and as the three of them watched the sunset together, it became increasingly difficult to imagine a future where they were not part of each other's lives. The months that followed seemed to pass faster than anyone expected. Sophie's regional science program became an incredible success. She returned home overflowing with new ideas, new friendships, and an even greater passion for learning. Emily watched her daughter grow more confident with each passing week, and every time she did, she thought back to the opportunity that nearly slipped away. More than once, she found herself quietly grateful for the unexpected chain of events that had changed all of their lives. Alexander remained a constant presence throughout it all. He attended Sophie's presentations when his schedule allowed. He celebrated her achievements with genuine enthusiasm. Most importantly, he continued showing up in the small moments that mattered. A phone call after a difficult day, a thoughtful message before an important meeting, a quiet conversation when someone needed encouragement. Those simple acts meant more than any grand gesture ever could. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the evening they first met, Emily found herself sitting in the same cafe where everything began. The familiar scent of coffee drifted through the air. Rain tapped gently against the windows just as it had that night. Across from her sat Alexander, smiling as he listened to Sophie enthusiastically explain a new science project. For a moment, Emily simply watched them. The scene felt ordinary, yet it was exactly the kind of ordinary she had once dreamed about. stability, trust, happiness, the ability to look toward the future without fear. Sophie eventually excused herself to browse a nearby bookstore, leaving Emily and Alexander alone. A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Alexander glanced around the cafe and laughed softly. You know, I still think about that night sometimes. Emily smiled. The night my date never showed up? That one. She shook her head. At the time, I thought it was one of the most embarrassing evenings of my life. Alexander leaned back in his chair. Funny how things work out. Emily looked around the room. The same tables, the same windows, the same rainy atmosphere. Yet everything felt different now. I spent weeks wondering why that happened, she admitted. I kept asking myself what I did wrong. Alexander immediately shook his head. You did nothing wrong. His voice carried the same calm certainty that had comforted her from the beginning. Emily felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. She realized how true those words were. The evening that once felt like rejection had actually been redirection. If the original plan had worked, she never would have met the man sitting across from her now. She never would have discovered a friendship built on trust, respect, and kindness. She never would have watched Sophie gain a mentor who genuinely believed in her potential. Alexander reached across the table and gently took her hand. There was nothing dramatic about the gesture. It felt natural, comfortable, right. Emily smiled through tears of gratitude she no longer felt the need to hide. Looking back, she understood the lesson better than ever. Life does not always give us what we expect. Sometimes doors close without explanation. Sometimes plans fall apart. Sometimes disappointment arrives disguised as failure. Yet every so often, what feels like the worst moment becomes the beginning of something extraordinary. A missed date led to an unexpected conversation. An unexpected conversation became a friendship. A friendship became trust. Trust became family. And as Emily looked toward Alexander and then toward Sophie laughing among the bookstore shelves,